As my friend Erwin Kotler said on Saturday, freedom of expression, assembly, and association are cornerstones of democracy, but Nazi symbolism, racist imagery, and desecration of war memorials are not. As my friend Erwin Kotler said on Saturday, freedom of expression, assembly, and association are cornerstones of democracy, but Nazi symbolism, racist imagery, and desecration of war memorials are not.
Already facing scrutiny amid a massive sexual misconduct scandal, the Canadian Forces will be reviewing how it trains and interacts with foreign military personnel after it was revealed our own officials met with a unit with ties to neo-Nazis. The review was sparked after concerns were raised by Jewish groups of the alleged involvement of Canadian troops in training a neo-Nazi-linked battalion in Ukraine, as well as warnings by soldiers last year that Canadians trained some Iraqis who were involved in torture and rape. I'm Dave Breckenridge, and this is 10-3. David Pugliese, who covers the military for the Ottawa Citizen, joins me to discuss the review and why the military's response is another sign of a need for a culture change in the forces. Don't forget you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, or even on Amazon Music now. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about us. So, David, one of the roles that the Canadian military has around the world is kind of going into countries where there's the possibility of hostilities erupting, or even in peacetime, and working with other armed forces, offering training, expertise. And that has in recent years included Ukraine. And I understand that the Canadian Forces are now reviewing how we train other countries' forces and how we interact with them due to our involvement with one specific unit in Ukraine. What can you tell us about the Azov Battalion?
So the Azov Battalion was an organization that emerged early on in the fighting in Ukraine. They were almost a separate militia, and then eventually they were brought into the Ukrainian military, the regular military. Now, the problem with the Azov Battalion is some of its leaders have openly acknowledged that they support Nazism. They've been branded neo-Nazis. They've been, seen with Nazi flags and that type of thing. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. Congress passed regulations that U.S. troops would not be allowed to interact with the Azov Battalion members or provide supplies or training.
Did Canadian officials going into Ukraine know about this unit, know that we'd be interacting with this battalion? And were there any concerns in the lead up to that raised with the soldiers who would be on the ground, to be careful of these neo-Nazis?
So the issue has been out there since 2015 when our first troops went to Ukraine to train. There was, acknowledgement that the Azov Battalion was in the country, operating in the country on the battlefield, but it was initially dismissed by the Canadian Forces leadership. In 2017, there was an intelligence briefing that I got that was done by our people in Ukraine, which essentially said the Azov Battalion is operating. It is Nazi affiliated, or large numbers of them have that belief. They openly have Nazi-related memorabilia and flags, etc. Then in 2018, we had our diplomats and our defense attaché meet with the Azov Battalion and their training cadre at a base in Ukraine. And they knew who they were meeting, so they got briefings from Azov. Azov photographers took pictures of the Canadians, shaking hands, that type of thing, and they used it in their propaganda. And so they put out on social media that, Canada was looking forward to working in the future with Azov Battalion.
How did the Canadian Forces respond to being used by a neo-Nazi battalion for propaganda purposes?
Well, they didn't actually. So what happened was this started circulating on social media, and they started getting some questions, but their response was to kind of ignore it. I mean, their response was they were worried that it would get out. It wasn't that they condemned the Azov battalion or anything like that. It was just their main concern was this would get out and it would be embarrassing to the Canadian forces. So then we fast forward to this year in September, where George Washington University does a report, and they go through social media of various Ukrainian soldiers. And one group who is affiliated with Azov is called Centurion. And so they collected all these social media postings from those involved in Centurion and taking part in neo-Nazi activities, giving Nazi salutes, discriminatory comments about the LGBT community, taking part in protests, that type of thing. Mm-hmm. So that came out and Canadian forces did nothing. Then 2 weeks later, Simon Wiesenthal Center and a number of other Jewish groups sent letters to the Prime Minister, said, what are you doing training these people? Because the people on social media that George Washington University had uncovered were bragging that they had been trained by Canadians.
And this isn't the only occasion where this has happened, right? Like, it's not just in Ukraine. There are other far-right movements in other countries in Europe where we've had soldiers on the ground, correct?
That's right. I mean, in Eastern Europe, they view, or some of the individuals in Eastern Europe and governments view their participation in support of Nazi Germany as something to be proud of. And they promote it. So there are parades for the SS in Latvia and Ukraine. In 2019, the Latvian defense minister issued a statement saying that the Latvian SS were the pride of Latvia. Just to go back, I mean, we fought the Nazis. Canada fought the Nazis during the Second World War, and along with the Russians and the United States and Britain and other Commonwealth countries, we defeated them.
Yeah.
And so when this was put out there, then Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan refused to condemn it. Not one Canadian general said, hey, wait a minute, this is out of line. And just to give you more context, the Latvian SS were among the last holdouts, Heinrich Himmler's headquarters in Berlin to fight to the bitter end. So we're not talking schoolboys here.
Right. Does Canada, when it goes into these other countries, whether it's to offer training to ally nations like Latvia, like Ukraine, or even when it goes into places like Iraq, do we vet the people who our soldiers are going to be working with?
No, there's no vetting at all. So we have the countries, the host countries, supposedly vet the individuals. And in many of these cases, they aren't vetted. And that is the problem. Now, the Canadian Forces says that, they don't have the resources to vet these individuals. One argument for cracking down on this is we're the ones providing the training. We're providing tens of millions of dollars of training and equipment. So some critics are saying we should be calling the shots. No, we don't want to train someone who, is giving a Nazi salute. Mm-hmm. In Iraq, some of the trainees were coming up to Canadian Forces soldiers and showing them videos of them raping women.
Oh,
the soldiers complained about that and were told by their officers, don't worry about it. Just don't look at the videos. So Canada does have certain things it can do. It's in the driver's seat. But there is a real reluctance in the Canadian Forces leadership to do any of this because they don't want to insult the host country.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even, some of your reporting revealed that in relation to the Azov battalion, the military was more worried about news stories coming out than it was about the battalion itself. What can you tell me about how that came to light?
Well, so on those warnings, on that concern, I got that through an access to information request. So I had seen the initial Azov social media, and, I was talking to people inside the defense headquarters, and they were worried that it would come to light. And I did mention it briefly in a larger story, but I wanted to see what was going on, what was the thinking of the Canadian Forces leadership at the time. So I put it in an access to information request. They withheld it for more than a year and a half. And then when it did come out, there was this concern that a journalist might find out about this meeting with the Azov. And again, what struck me was there was no emails or even media talking points that, you know what, these guys are bad news. We shouldn't be even near them. There was none of that. It was all like, oh, well, what happens if journalists find out, and that type of thing.
Does the government have any policy, or the military, Canadian Forces, have any policy with regard to groups like this? Like, we're not going to train them, we condemn them. Is there anything written down that showed up in your ATIP request?
So they have never condemned the Azov battalion. They have a general line that they do not support or condone the glorification of Nazi Germany. But there is no direct condemnation of any of these specific groups. The main concern is, if a journalist or the public finds out about